The house in San Angel had always been too big for Refugio. Too many empty rooms, too many hallways where her footsteps echoed like the whispers of loneliness. But there she was every morning at 6 o'clock sharp, cleaning the marble floors that cost more than she would ever earn in her life. Don Ernesto Villalobos had hired her 10 years ago, right after his wife died in childbirth, and he was left alone with a newborn baby in his arms. A businessman who handled millions didn't know how to change a diaper. Desperation drove him to knock on the door of the domestic worker agency in the Obrera neighborhood, and there was Refugio, with her calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much. She didn't ask any questions. She simply took the child, cradled him to her chest, and something in that baby's gaze pierced her soul like lightning on a stormy night. Mateo grew up calling her Cuca. Never Mom, never Refugio in full, just Cuca. Don Ernesto had made that clear from the start, when she dared to sing him a lullaby that his own mother used to sing to him. "You're here to work, not to get attached," he told her with that coldness of the wealthy, who believe that money buys limits in the human heart. But how could she not get attached to that brown-eyed boy who sought her out at night when nightmares woke him, who ran to hug her when she fell in the garden, who saved her the biggest piece of his lunch from private school, even though she had already eaten her beans in the kitchen? Refugio slept in the maid's quarters, that space next to the laundry room that smelled of bleach and detergent, but every morning she got up and peeked into Mateo's room to make sure he was tucked in. Don Ernesto lived in his office, in his meetings, on his trips to Monterrey and Miami. He arrived late, left early, and Mateo called him Dad with the same distance with which one greets a stranger in the elevator. Before we continue, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which Mexican state you're watching from. I believe this story found you today for a reason. The years passed as they do in the homes of the wealthy, slowly, for those who clean, and quickly for those who barely notice. Mateo turned 5, then 7, then 9. Refugio saw him lose his first tooth, take his first steps on a bicycle, cry when the other children at school made fun of him for being shy. She was the one who mended his uniform when it tore, who memorized his allergies better than any doctor, who knew he was afraid of thunder and that he liked to sleep with the hallway light on. Don Ernesto would appear on birthdays with expensive gifts wrapped by his secretary and disappear before the cake. "I have an important meeting," he would always say, and Mateo stopped asking him to stay. At night, when the boy did his homework at the kitchen table because Cuca was there preparing dinner, he would tell her things he would never tell his father. That he wanted to be a veterinarian because it hurt him to see animals suffer. That sometimes he felt he didn't belong in that big cold house. She missed something she had never had, but she didn't know what it was. Refugio kept a secret that burned in her gut every morning. She kept it in a metal box hidden beneath her mattress, along with the few photos of her family in Oaxaca and a rosary blessed by the priest in her village. Inside that box were documents Don Ernesto thought he'd destroyed years ago. Papers she'd rescued from his study one night. He came home drunk and furious, burning things in the fireplace and cursing between sobs. She'd plunged her hand into the still hot ashes and pulled out what she could, not quite knowing why, just following an instinct that screamed at her that someday this would be important. For 10 years she carried that weight, watching Mateo grow up without knowing the truth about who he really was, where he came from, or why Don Ernesto treated him with that mixture of obligation and resentment that a true father would never have. Mateo turned 10 on a Thursday in March. It was raining like it only rains in Mexico City when the sky decides to let it all out. Don Ernesto didn't even come home that night. He sent a message saying he was busy with important negotiations. Refugio baked a chocolate cake, the boy's favorite, and sang Las Mañanitas to him, her voice trembling with emotion. Mateo blew out the candles, And when she asked him what he had wished for, he looked at her with those eyes that were already beginning to ask dangerous questions, and said something that chilled her to the bone. "I wish to know why my dad looks at me like I'm a mistake he has to put up with. I wish to know why you're the only one who truly loves me in this house." Refugio felt the ground give way beneath her feet. The boy was growing up. He was no longer the baby she could distract with songs and stories. He was asking questions that deserved answers. That night, after Matteo fell asleep, Refugio sat in the maid's quarters with the metal box on her lap. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the charred documents. There was a birth certificate that didn't match the one hanging in Don Ernesto's study. There were photographs of a woman who wasn't the man's deceased wife, a woman with indigenous features and a shy smile holding a newborn baby. There were letters written in shaky handwriting, love letters and pleas, letters that spoke of broken promises and threats. And there was a legal document, a paternity suit that never reached the courts, because the woman in the photos turned up dead 3 months after the birth, drowned in the Lerma River, under circumstances the police closed as a suicide. Too quickly, too conveniently. Refugio read it all again, even though she already knew it by heart. Matteo wasn't Don Ernesto's wife's son. He was the son of Rosa, a domestic worker like herself, a woman whom the boss had impregnated and then wanted to erase from history. The truth had been like a piece of glass buried in Refugio's chest for a decade, and now Matteo was growing up, asking questions, deserving answers. But telling the truth meant destroying everything. It meant Don Ernesto could throw her out on the street, take away the boy she had raised as her own, or worse. It meant Matteo would discover that his entire life was a lie built on a grave. Refugio closed the box and pressed it to her chest. Outside it was still raining, and somewhere in that enormous house a 10-year-old boy slept, unaware that his nanny held the secret that would change everything, the secret that explained why she loved him with a desperation that went beyond duty, beyond affection. Because Rosa, the woman in the photographs, the woman Don Ernesto had erased from history, was his younger sister. And that boy who called Refugio Cuca wasn't just the baby she had cared for. He was her nephew. He was the only family she had left in this world. It was the reason she breathed every morning in that cold house where secrets lived in the walls, and the truth waited like a bomb about to explode. Refugio didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the metal box as if it were a venomous snake she didn't dare touch or let go of. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy, thick, like when something bad is about to happen and everyone feels it in their bones. At 5 in the morning, she got up as usual, washed her face with cold water, trying to get rid of the dark circles under her eyes that betrayed her lack of sleep, and went downstairs to make breakfast. Matteo appeared in the kitchen at 7, wearing his school uniform, with that boyish face that was already growing up. "Good morning, Cuca," he said, and something in his voice sounded different, more serious, as if he too had spent the night thinking about questions he didn't dare ask aloud. Refugio served him pancakes with honey, just the way he liked them, but she noticed that the boy barely touched them. He just looked at her with those brown eyes that were identical to Rosa's, so identical that sometimes Refugio had to turn away because it hurt too much to see her dead sister reflected in that kid's face. Don Ernesto arrived that afternoon, which was unusual because he almost never showed up during the week. He was wearing a new suit and an expensive tie, and he smelled of that French cologne that cost thousands of pesos a bottle. But there was something else in his eyes, a tension in his jaw that Refugio had learned to recognize over the past 10 years. He was there to cause trouble. He locked himself in his study and started making calls, his voice echoing through the thick walls of the old house. Refugio could make out snippets of words as she cleaned the hallway. Boarding school, Switzerland? He's old enough. It's the best thing for the boy. She felt her blood run cold. Matteo was in his room doing homework, unaware that his father was planning to send him away, take him out of the country, enroll him in one of those European schools where wealthy Mexicans hide away their troublesome children. Refugio gripped the cleaning rag tightly until her knuckles turned white. 10 years taking care of that child, 10 years being his only real family, and now Don Ernesto wanted to tear him away like someone throwing away something they no longer need. That night, after Matteo fell asleep, Don Ernesto called Refugio into the study. She entered, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart pounding so hard she felt it would burst from her chest. The man sat behind his mahogany desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, wearing the expression of a man accustomed to unquestioning obedience. "Sit down, Refugio," he said, and the fact that he used her full name instead of just you or the girl confirmed that serious trouble was coming. She sat on the edge of the chair, back straight, hands on her knees. "The boy is going to study in Europe in August," Don Ernesto said bluntly, without softening the blow. "Everything's been arranged. A boarding school in Switzerland, one of the best. He'll be better off there, far from all this." Refugio felt the world crumble around her, but she kept her composure. "And the holidays, sir? Are you coming back for the holidays?" Don Ernesto took a long drink before answering. "He'll spend the holidays there. He has summer camps, activities. There's no point in him coming and going. It's better if he makes his life there." What he was saying was crystal clear. He wanted to erase Matteo from his life, send him far away, and forget he existed. Refugio felt something break inside her, something she had been holding on to for 10 years. "With all due respect, sir, but that boy needs you. You're his father. You can't just send him away like that." Don Ernesto looked at her with those cold, shark-like eyes she had seen so many times. "You have no say in how I raise my son. You're here to cook and clean, nothing more. And I'm going to tell you something, Refugio, because I think you've taken too many liberties with the boy these past few years. When Matteo leaves, your services will no longer be needed. I'll give you a generous severance package, 3 months' salary. But I want you out of this house. I don't need a maid if there's no child to take care of." The words hit like stones. He was firing her. After 10 years of giving her entire life to that boy, of being the only mother Matteo had ever known, he was throwing her out on the street like an old piece of furniture. Refugio stood up slowly, trembling with rage and pain. "Why do you hate him so much, sir? What did that boy do to make you treat him like this? He's your son." Don Ernesto stood up as well, his face red with anger. "That boy is a mistake I've carried for 10 years, a mistake that cost me everything, and I'm not going to discuss this with the servants. You may leave." Refugio left the studio, her legs trembling. She locked herself in her room and took out the metal box again. Her hands were no longer shaking. Now she was determined. Don Ernesto had crossed the line. If he was going to take Matteo away from her, if he was going to send her away and erase the only 10 years of her life that had been worthwhile, then she was going to reveal the truth. She was going to show the world who Ernesto Villalobos really was. A man who had impregnated a maid, who had threatened her when she demanded he acknowledge the baby, who had probably had something to do with her death, even if it could never be proven. Rosa had told her everything in letters that Refugio kept in Oaxaca, letters that arrived in the months before her death, letters in which her sister begged her that if anything happened to her, please take care of her baby. Refugio had arrived too late to save Rosa, but she hadn't arrived too late to save Matteo. She had pretended to be just an ordinary employee, hidden the fact that she was the boy's aunt, endured 10 years of humiliation just to be near him. But she couldn't take it anymore. She wasn't going to let Don Ernesto destroy her nephew's life too. The next morning, Matteo went downstairs for breakfast and noticed something strange about Cuca. She was looking at him differently, with a mixture of tenderness and sadness that the boy didn't understand. "Are you all right, Cuca?" he asked as she poured him orange juice. Refugio sat down across from him, something she never did because Don Ernesto had forbidden her from sitting at the table with the boy. "Matteo, my love, I need to talk to you about something important." The boy put his glass down on the table, frightened by his nanny's serious tone. "What's wrong? Are you leaving?" Refugio felt her voice crack. "Your father wants to send you to a boarding school in Europe, and he wants me to leave this house when you leave." Matteo turned pale. No, he can't do that. I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave you." He stood up and hugged Refugio with the desperation of a child who feels that the only thing he loves in the world is being taken away. She hugged him back, pressing him to her chest, and in that moment she made her final decision. She was going to tell him everything. She was going to tell him who she really was, who his real mother had been, why Don Ernesto treated him like a burden. Matteo deserved to know the truth before they sent him away. But just as Refugio opened her mouth to speak, the kitchen door burst open. Don Ernesto stood there, his face contorted with fury. "What the hell is going on here? Are you filling the boy's head with ideas?" Matteo pulled away from Refugio, angrily wiping away his tears. "You want to send me away? You want to get rid of me like I'm trash?" Don Ernesto took 2 steps toward his son, and for a second Refugio thought he was going to hit her. She stepped between them, her heart pounding. "Don't you dare touch him, sir!" Don Ernesto glared at her with pure, distilled hatred. "You're fired right now. Pack your things and get out of my house." Matteo shouted, "No!" But Don Ernesto grabbed his arm. "You're going to your room, now!" The boy looked at Refugio, his eyes filled with tears, pleading with his gaze for her to do something, anything. And there, in that moment of utter despair, Refugio uttered the words she had kept bottled up for 10 years. "Let him go. Let my nephew go right now, or I swear to God I'll go to the police with everything I know about Rosa's death." The silence that fell over the kitchen was so thick it cut through the air, making even breathing painful. Don Ernesto froze, his hand still gripping Matteo's arm, his face turning from red with rage to paper white in a matter of seconds. Matteo stared at Refugio, speechless, mouth agape, trying to process what he'd just heard. Nephew. He'd said, nephew. Rosa, a name he'd never heard before. Don Ernesto slowly released the boy, his fingers moving on their own, and took a step toward Refugio with an expression she'd never seen on his face, a mixture of panic and rage that made him look like a cornered animal. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, his voice trembling, but it wasn't a threat anymore. It was pure fear. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Refugio stood firm, though her legs were buckling. "I know exactly what I'm getting into, sir. I've known for 10 years, 10 years carrying the truth while you slept soundly in your expensive bed." Matteo began to back away from the wall, his eyes darting from one to the other as if he were watching 2 strangers arguing in a language he didn't understand. Don Ernesto closed his eyes, and when he opened them, something inside him had given up, as if he knew that the 10-year-long lie had just exploded and there was no way to pick up the pieces. "Matteo, go to your room," he said in a voice that suddenly sounded old, tired, but the boy didn't move. "No! I want to know what's going on. I want to know what Cuca meant." His voice broke on the last word. "Why did she say, 'I'm her nephew'? Who is Rosa?" Refugio felt her heart break, seeing the confusion on her nephew's face, but she had already crossed the bridge and there was no going back. She knelt in front of Matteo, taking his hands, which were icy cold despite the morning's warmth. "Rosa was my little sister, my Rosita, and she was your mother, my love, your real mother." Matteo shook his head, tears beginning to roll down his cheeks. "No, My mother died when I was born. My father told me so. She was his wife and died in childbirth. Refugio squeezed the boy's hands tighter. That's what he told you, but it's not true. Your mother wasn't his wife. Your mother was a girl from Oaxaca who worked in this house, just like me. And he got her pregnant. And when she asked him to acknowledge the baby, to acknowledge you, everything turned very ugly. Don Ernesto slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. That's enough, Refugio. Don't go on. But she wasn't going to stop now. Not after 10 years of silence, 10 years of biting her tongue while watching her nephew grow up without knowing who he really was. 3 months after you were born, my sister was found dead in the Lerma River. The police said it was suicide, but Rosa would never have killed herself, not when she had a baby to live for. She wrote me letters before she died, letters where she told me that your father was threatening her, that she was afraid of what might happen to her. And then she died, and the investigation was closed in 2 weeks, just like that, as if her life meant nothing. Mateo began to sob, his whole body trembling. It can't be true. It can't be. He turned to Don Ernesto with a heartbreaking desperation. Tell her it's not true. Please, Dad, tell her she's lying. But Don Ernesto did not raise his head. He said nothing, and his silence was the most devastating confirmation the boy could have received. Refugio stood up and went to her room. She returned with the metal box, her hands no longer trembling because adrenaline now coursed through her veins like fire. She placed the box on the kitchen table and began to take out the documents one by one. The real birth certificate, where Rosa Mendez appeared as the mother, leaving the space for the father blank. The photographs of Rosa holding a newborn baby, her face radiant with the pure love only mothers possess. The letters written in shaky handwriting, where Rosa told her sister she was terrified, that Don Ernesto had told her he was going to take the baby away, that he was going to deport her back to Oaxaca, and that she would never see her son again. The paternity suit Rosa had filed with a public defender, the same one that never reached court because she died before the first hearing, and the small, yellowed newspaper clipping, just 3 lines in the crime section, unidentified woman found dead in the Lerma River. Authorities investigate possible suicide. They hadn't even put her name in the newspaper, as if Rosa were nobody, as if her life didn't matter. Mateo stared at the documents, his eyes unfocused, trying to process information that was too overwhelming, too horrifying for his 10-year-old brain. He picked up one of the photographs with trembling hands, the one where Rosa smiled at the camera, holding him as a baby. She looks like me, he whispered. She has my eyes. Refugio sat beside him, putting her arm around him. You're identical to her, my love. Every time I see you, it's like seeing my Rosita again. Mateo began to cry harder, that heart-wrenching cry of a child who has just discovered his entire life was a lie. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you let me believe my mother was someone else? Refugio felt guilt slashing her chest like knives. Because I was afraid. I was afraid Don Ernesto would kick me out and take me away from you. You were all I had left of Rosa. I couldn't lose you too. Don Ernesto finally raised his head, and when he spoke, his voice was broken, shattered. I didn't kill her. I need you to know that. I didn't touch Rosa. Refugio turned to him with a fury she had been holding in for 10 years. But you didn't protect her either. You threatened her. You took her baby. You made her feel like she had no way out. And when she died, you made sure no one asked questions. Don Ernesto stood up, staggering like a drunkard even though he hadn't had a drink. I was married. My wife was sick, dying of cancer. If she'd found out about the baby, she would have been devastated. I had to protect her. Refugio let out a bitter laugh. Protect her, but not Rosa. Of course, because your rich wife and your reputation were worth more than the life of a poor girl from Oaxaca. Don Ernesto gripped the back of his chair. My wife died 2 months before Rosa. When that happened, I was going to make things right. I was going to acknowledge the child, but then Rosa—" His voice broke. "Then Rosa turned up dead, and everything went to hell. I don't know what happened that night. The police said suicide, and I let them say it because if they investigated further, they would find the paternity suit. They would make a scene. They would destroy everything I had built. So I paid them to close the case quickly. I brought the baby to this house. I made up the story that he was my dead wife's son, and I tried to move on." Matteo looked at him with a mixture of horror and disgust that no child should feel for his father. "You lied to me my whole life. You made me believe that my mother was someone who never even existed." The tension in that kitchen was like a pressure cooker about to explode. Refugio knew there was more, that the darkest part of the story was yet to come, but she wasn't sure if Matteo could handle any more truths in a single day. Don Ernesto approached his son, his hands outstretched as if he wanted to touch him but didn't dare. "I love you, Matteo. I know it doesn't seem like it. I know I've been a bad father, but I swear I love you." Matteo recoiled from him as if he were burning him. "You don't love me. You never have. Cuca is right. You see me as a mistake, as something that ruined your perfect life." Don Ernesto opened his mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come out because they both knew it was true. Refugio stepped between them again. "There's something else you need to know. Something I found 2 years ago, rummaging through the old files in the studio when you sent me to clean there." She took a yellowed manila envelope from the box, bearing the seal of a private laboratory. "This is a DNA test, sir. A test you took when Matteo was 3 years old, probably to be sure before forging the adoption papers." Refugio pulled the document from the envelope, his hands now trembling, for this was the final truth, the one that changed absolutely everything. According to this test, Don Ernesto Villalobos is not Matteo's biological father. The probability of paternity is 0%. The silence that followed those words was the kind that makes time stand still. Matteo stared at Don Ernesto. Don Ernesto stared at the document as if it were a death sentence, and Refugio looked at them both, knowing he had just detonated a nuclear bomb in the middle of that kitchen. Don Ernesto collapsed to his knees on the floor, sobbing, as Refugio had never seen him cry. "I knew it from that moment. I knew it, and yet I kept him, because it's what my wife would have wanted, because Rosa had died, and the boy had no one else, because—" He broke down completely. "Because despite everything I already loved him. He was already my son, even if he wasn't my blood." Matteo backed up to the wall, the world crumbling around him. "So who's my dad? If it's not you, who is it?" And there it was, the question Refugio had spent 2 years trying to answer, the question that had driven her to investigate on her own, to search for clues in Rosa's letters, to talk to people in town who remembered those months before her sister died. And she had found something, a name Rosa mentioned in her last letters with fear and shame, a name that explained why Don Ernesto might not have killed Rosa, but also hadn't done anything to save her. Because Matteo's real father was someone far more dangerous, someone who still held power in this town, someone who might have had everything to do with Rosa ending up dead in that river. Refugio took a deep breath before saying the name he had discovered 2 years earlier, the name that explained so much, so many silences, so many fearful glances in Don Ernesto's eyes when he thought no one was watching. "Matteo's real father is Gustavo Villalobos, your older brother, sir. Your brother, the federal deputy." Don Ernesto jerked his head up so fast, Refugio heard his neck crack. His face turned ashen. "How the hell did you know that?" His voice was barely a whisper, choked with panic. Refugio pulled more letters from the box, the last ones Rosa had sent him before she died, the ones that had arrived in Oaxaca a week after the funeral. "Rosa told me everything in these letters. She told me that Gustavo often came to this house when you were traveling, that he took advantage of her, that he threatened her, saying that if she spoke, he would deport her and her whole family. That when she got pregnant, she begged him for help, and he told her that it was your problem, that you owned the house and you had to take care of it. Matteo slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, hugging his knees, trying to make himself small, as if that way he could disappear from this impossible reality. Don Ernesto stood up, unsteady on his feet, clutching the table to keep from falling. Gustavo came to see me when Rosa started pressuring me about the paternity suit. He told me he'd been with her once, that he was drunk, that it was a mistake. He begged me to take responsibility for the child because if it came out that a federal congressman had gotten the maid pregnant, his political career would be ruined. He offered me money, connections, promised to help me grow my business if I acknowledged the baby as mine and kept my mouth shut. Refugio felt rage rising in her throat like bile. And you agreed. You agreed to take on a child that wasn't yours to protect your brother, the politician. Don Ernesto ran his hands over his face. My wife had just died. My business was bankrupt. Gustavo was my only family, my only way out. I desperately needed his help. So yes, I agreed. I kept the baby, forged papers, made up the story that he was my wife's and my son. And when Rosa started threatening to go to the media, to expose everything... His voice broke again. I begged Gustavo to talk to her, to offer her money to fix the problem. And 2 days later, Rosa turned up dead in the river. The silence that followed was so thick that Refugio could hear her own heart pounding in her ears. Matteo slowly raised his head, his eyes red and swollen from crying. "Are you saying that man, that Gustavo, killed my mother?" His voice sounded strange, robotic, as if he had disconnected from his emotions to keep functioning. Don Ernesto shook his head frantically. "I don't know. I never knew. I never wanted to know. The police closed the case as a suicide, and I didn't ask any questions because I was too afraid of the answers. Gustavo told me he hadn't done anything, that Rosa had committed suicide because of postpartum depression, and I forced myself to believe him because the alternative was too horrible." Refugio let out a humorless laugh. "Of course, you forced yourself to believe him. Meanwhile, you kept your brother's baby, accepted his dirty money, built your empire with his help, and treated Matteo like a burden you had to bear because every time you looked at him, he reminded you of what you had done, how cowardly you had been." Don Ernesto turned to face her, his eyes bloodshot. "And what about you, Refugio? Are you so innocent? You've been here for 10 years knowing the truth, and you never said a word. You let that child grow up in a lie just like I did." The blow struck a chord, and Refugio felt guilt like a punch to the gut. "You're right, I'm guilty too. I stayed silent because I was afraid, because I didn't have enough proof, because I thought it was better for Matteo to have a roof over his head and food, even with a father who didn't want him, than to end up in an orphanage or with social services. But no more. I'm not going to let Gustavo Villalobos get away with this anymore. I'm not going to let him continue living his perfect life as a respectable politician while Matteo's mother rots in an unmarked grave in Oaxaca." Don Ernesto took a step toward her, his fear morphing into something more dangerous. Don't you dare go to anyone about this. Gustavo is untouchable. He has friends everywhere, judges, police officers, journalists. If you try to expose him, he'll destroy you. He'll make you disappear, just like he made any evidence of what happened to Rosa disappear. But Refugio had already made her decision. She knelt before Matteo and cupped his face in her hands with infinite tenderness. "Listen carefully, my love. Your mother was the kindest person I've ever known. She was sweet, hard-working, and dreamed of studying nursing someday, and these powerful men used her and threw her away like trash. But you're not trash. You're the best thing she left in this world. And I swear to you by the Virgin of Guadalupe that I'm going to get justice for her, even if it costs me my life." Matteo hugged her with a desperation that broke his heart. I don't want anything to happen to you, Kuka. I already lost my mother. I can't lose you too. Refugio held him close, inhaling the scent of his hair, which still smelled of the apple shampoo she used to buy him. You won't lose me, I promise. But I need you to be strong. I need you to help me. Can you do that for your mother, for your Rosita? Matteo nodded against her chest, still sobbing but with something new in his posture, something like determination or perhaps righteous anger. Don Ernesto slumped into a chair, defeated. You don't know what you're getting yourselves into. Gustavo isn't just a congressman, he's about to launch his campaign for governor. He has millions in his campaign. He has the drug cartels financing him. He has people who would kill for him without asking questions. If you start stirring this shit up, you'll bury both of you. Refugio put all the documents back in the box, her hands now steady and confident. Then we'll have to outsmart him. We'll have to move fast. She turned to Don Ernesto with a hard look. And you're going to help us. You're going to help us, or I swear I'll take you down along with your brother. You forged documents too. You covered up a possible murder too. You profited from all of this too. Don Ernesto looked at her with something resembling respect for the first time in 10 years. What do you want me to do? Refugio thought quickly, the plan forming in her head as she spoke. I want you to get more information about the night Rosa died. Gustavo must have left traces. Someone must know something. And I want you to give me access to your lawyers, your contacts. We're going to need legal protection when this blows up. But before Don Ernesto could answer, the doorbell rang 3 times, loud and insistent. The 3 of them exchanged glances, the same thought crossing their minds. No one rang the doorbell like that, unless it was an emergency or a threat. Don Ernesto went pale. No, it can't be. Not so fast. Refugio felt a chill run down her spine. Do you have security cameras? Don Ernesto nodded and hurried to the monitor in his study. Refugio followed, Matteo clinging to her back. On the screen, 2 black SUVs with tinted windows were parked outside the house. 5 men in dark suits and sunglasses stood at the entrance. One of them rang the doorbell again, this time more insistently. Don Ernesto slumped in his chair, his face as red as wax. It's Gustavo's people. He always uses the same kind of bodyguards. He knows. I don't know how the hell, but he already knows we're talking about this. Refugio felt panic rising in her throat, but she forced herself to stay calm. She looked at Matteo, who was trembling beside her. Is there a back exit from this house? Don Ernesto jumped up, his survival instinct finally kicking in. Yes. There's a door in the garden that leads to the back alley. No one's used it in years, but it's locked. He ran to a drawer in his desk and pulled out a bunch of old rusty keys. He tossed them to Refugio. The 3rd one on the key ring. Take the boy and leave. I'll keep them busy. Refugio caught the keys in mid-air, her heart pounding. And what are you going to do? Don Ernesto pulled out his cell phone. I'm going to call my lawyer. I'm going to tell him to get everything ready in case we all get arrested, and I'm going to open that door and face my brother like I should have 10 years ago. For the first time since Refugio had known him, she saw something resembling courage in the man's eyes. She grabbed Matteo's hand and started running toward the kitchen, toward the back door, toward an exit that was probably already blocked. But just as they reached the garden, they heard a terrible crash, as if someone had kicked the front door open. Male voices shouted, "Where's the boy?" And then a gunshot. A single shot that stopped everyone in their tracks. Refugio turned toward the hallway, pulling Matteo behind her, and what she saw chilled her blood. Don Ernesto lay on the foyer floor, a red stain spreading across his chest, and standing over him with a still-smoking pistol was a tall man in a grey suit who had the exact same brown eyes as Matteo. Gustavo Villalobos had come personally to clean up his mess. Refugio shoved Matteo behind her with such force that the boy almost fell. "Run," she whispered, her urgency making each word tremble. "Run to the garden, jump the fence, don't look back." But Matteo was frozen, staring at Don Ernesto lying on the ground, blood forming a pool that spread like a dark flower on the white marble. Gustavo Villalobos walked toward them with slow, calculated steps, the pistol still in his hand, but pointed at the ground. He was taller than Refugio had imagined, with the kind of presence men have who are used to making everyone else shrink around them. He wore a suit that probably cost more than she would earn in 5 years. His hair perfectly combed with grey at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than old. He had the face of someone who appears on the news talking about justice and progress, but his eyes were as cold as a shark's. "Refugio Mendez," she said in a soft voice that was more terrifying than any scream. "Rosa's sister. I've known about you for years, but I never felt the need to do anything about it as long as you behaved. It seems I made a mistake in underestimating you." The men in black suits entered the house and spread out, blocking all the exits. Refugio quickly calculated the chances of escape, and they were all 0. They were trapped. She pushed Matteo further behind her, even though she knew it was useless, that there was no way to protect him from this. "You killed my sister," she said, her voice firmer than she felt inside. "You killed her because she was going to expose that you raped a maid and got her pregnant." Gustavo smiled, and it was the most horrible smile Refugio had ever seen, full of white teeth and devoid of anything human. "Rape is a very ugly word, Mom. Rosa and I had a consensual encounter. The problem was that she didn't understand that the encounter meant nothing, that she meant nothing. When she started making ridiculous demands, I had to take steps to protect my career and my family." She crouched down beside Don Ernesto, who was still breathing but barely, blood trickling from his mouth. "My poor brother. He was always so weak, so sentimental. I paid him for 10 years to keep his mouth shut, and in the end he couldn't even do that right." Matteo stepped out from behind Refugio with a bravery that no 10-year-old should possess. Tears streamed down his face, but his voice remained clear. "You killed my mother! You're my father, and you killed my mother." Gustavo looked at him the way one looks at an interesting but irritating insect. "I'm not your father, child. I'm simply the man who had the misfortune of impregnating the wrong maid, and your mother killed herself when she decided to be dramatic and threaten me. I only suggested that it would be better for everyone if she disappeared." She took my words too literally. Refugio felt something shatter inside her, the last shred of hope that perhaps there was an explanation. Perhaps it had been an accident. But no. This man had driven Rosa to suicide with threats and terror, or worse, perhaps he had killed her with his own hands and made it look like suicide. And now he stood there admitting everything as if nothing had happened, because he knew he had the power to get away with it. "People need to know who you really are," Refugio said, her voice breaking. "You have to pay for what you did." Gustavo let out a laugh that sounded genuinely amused. "The people? What people, Refugio? The journalists on my payroll? The police officers I've put in their positions? The judges who owe me favors? I'm untouchable. I can make you both disappear tonight. And tomorrow the story will be that the crazy nanny killed Don Ernesto Villalobos in a robbery gone wrong, took the kidnapped child, and they both died in a tragic car accident on the way to the border. Believe me, I've done it before. It's easier than you think." He raised the pistol and pointed it directly at Refugio's head. Matteo screamed and lunged at Gustavo, punching him with his small fists. But one of the bodyguards grabbed his arm and pulled him back. Refugio closed his eyes, waiting for the shot, waiting for the end. But all he heard was Don Ernesto's voice, faint but clear from the floor. "Gustavo! Gustavo! Listen to me!" Gustavo lowered the pistol and turned to his dying brother. "What do you want, Ernesto? A few last words before you go." Don Ernesto coughed up blood but smiled, and there was something triumphant about that smile that gave Refugio a glimmer of hope. I recorded you. I recorded you confessing everything. The security cameras have audio, and the system is connected to the cloud. It uploads everything automatically. It's too late now, brother. Everything you said is stored on servers you can't touch." The color drained from Gustavo's face. He turned to one of his men. "Disconnect the cameras. Download everything from the internet now." The man ran toward the studio, but Don Ernesto was still smiling. "You won't be able to. I gave 3 different lawyers access to the system 5 minutes ago when you entered the house. I instructed them that if anything happened to me or my family, they should release everything. Videos, documents, everything." He coughed up more blood. "You should have killed me faster, Gustavo. You gave me time." Gustavo froze, his brain racing, trying to calculate options, to find a way out. Refugio seized the opportunity presented by the distraction, lunging at the man holding Matteo and digging her nails into his face with the fury of 10 years of silence. The man screamed and dropped the child. "Run, Matteo, run!" Matteo ran toward the back door, but stopped halfway across the garden. He turned and ran back, not toward the exit, but toward Don Ernesto's study. Refugio called his name, but the boy had already disappeared down the hallway. Gustavo shot Refugio, but the bullet grazed her shoulder instead of hitting her chest because she had moved at the last second. The pain was like liquid fire, but she kept moving, kept fighting, because if she stopped, they were dead. She heard shouts coming from the study, the sound of things falling, and then Matteo's voice, loud and clear, amplified by something. The boy had found the house's intercom system, the one Don Ernesto used to make announcements when he threw parties. "Help! Help! Gustavo Villalobos killed Don Ernesto! He's at the house in San Angel trying to kill us!" The boy's voice blasted from all the house's speakers, including the powerful speakers in the garden that the neighbors could probably hear. "It's Congressman Gustavo Villalobos. He killed my mother, Rosa Mendez, 10 years ago, and now he's killed her brother. Someone call the police." Gustavo ran toward the study, but it was too late. Police lights were already visible through the windows. Sirens approaching. A neighbor had called after hearing the gunshots, or perhaps Don Ernesto's lawyers had called after receiving the files. Gustavo stood in the middle of the room, his pistol still in his hand, surrounded by his men, who suddenly didn't know what to do. Refugio crawled over to Don Ernesto and took his cold hand. He looked at her with eyes that were already fading. "Take care of my son," she whispered. "Even though he's not my blood, he's my son. Take care of him." Refugio nodded, tears streaming down her face, mingling with the blood from her wounded shoulder. "I promise. I promise." Don Ernesto closed his eyes and stopped breathing, just as the police broke down the door and stormed in, guns drawn. Matteo ran out of the studio and threw himself into Refugio's arms, both falling to the floor in each other's arms, crying, alive against all odds. The months that followed were a whirlwind of trials, reporters, psychologists, and lawyers. Gustavo Villalobos was arrested that very night. The security footage was irrefutable evidence of everything he had admitted. The investigation into Rosa's death was reopened, and this time, justice was served. They found witnesses who had been afraid to speak for years. They found evidence that Gustavo had bribed the coroner to close the case quickly. They found connections to organized crime that brought down not only him, but 6 other politicians. The scandal was so huge that it dominated the national news for weeks. Rosa Mendez went from being an unnamed woman in a small newspaper article to a symbol, a rallying cry, a reminder of how many other poor women had been used and discarded by powerful men. Refugio gave interviews, wept on camera, and told her sister's story over and over until her throat was raw. But she did it because Rosa deserved to be remembered. She deserved for her name to mean more than just a forgotten statistic. Matteo went to therapy 3 times a week for the first year. A 10-year-old shouldn't have to process everything he had been through, but little by little, with help and Refugio's unwavering love, he began to heal. The court decided that Refugio was the most appropriate legal guardian for the boy. She was his only blood relative, the only person who had always loved him unconditionally. Don Ernesto's inheritance was placed in a trust for Matteo until he turned 21. Enough money for them both to live comfortably without having to depend on anyone. Refugio sold the house in San Angel because neither of them could bear to be there after everything that had happened. They bought a smaller house in Coyoacan, with a garden where Matteo could play and a maid's quarters that Refugio converted into his own bedroom, even though the boy insisted on staying in the big room. "You're my aunt, you're my mum now. You don't have to sleep in the maid's room anymore," he told her, with the seriousness of children who have matured too quickly. Gustavo Villalobos was sentenced to 30 years in prison for homicide, obstruction of justice, and a long list of other crimes. He appealed, of course, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Refugio went to the courthouse on sentencing day and looked him straight in the eye as he was led away in handcuffs. She felt neither satisfaction nor revenge, only a profound weariness and the feeling that finally, after 10 years, she could breathe freely. Rosa could rest in peace. Her son knew the truth. His killer was paying. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to compensate for a life taken, but it was something. It was justice, imperfect and belated, but justice nonetheless. Matteo turned 11 in his new home. Refugio baked a chocolate cake as usual, but this time there were no secrets between them, no lies poisoning the air. The boy blew out the candles, and when Refugio asked him what he had wished for, he smiled for the first time in months. "I wish that my mom Rosa would be proud of me wherever she is, and I wish that you would never leave." Refugio hugged him so tightly she could barely breathe. "I'm not going anywhere, my love. You're my family. You're all I have left of my Rosita, and I'm going to take care of you until I die." Matteo pulled back slightly and looked at her with those brown eyes, identical to his mother's. "Can you tell me more about her? About what she was like when she was a little girl?" And Refugio told him. She told him about Rosa running through the streets of her village in Oaxaca, about how she sang while washing clothes in the river, about how she dreamed of being a nurse and helping people. He told her about the good things, the sweet memories that deserved to be remembered more than the horror of her death. Years passed, and Matteo grew into a boy who knew his roots, who understood that life could be unfair, but that justice could also prevail if people were brave enough to fight for it. He became a veterinarian, just as he had always dreamed, the first member of his family to attend university. On his graduation day, Refugio sat in the front row, weeping with pride, a photograph of Rosa in her lap. "We did it, little sister," she whispered. "Your son did it." Matteo dedicated his degree to 2 women, to Rosa Mendez, his mother, who died too young but gave him life, and to Refugio Mendez, his aunt, who became like a mother to him and taught him that true love has nothing to do with blood and everything to do with staying, with fighting, with never giving up. Rosa's story ceased to be just a tragedy and became a legacy, a seed of change, a reminder that even the most invisible women in this country deserve justice, deserve to be remembered, deserve for their children to grow up knowing that they existed and that they loved with all their hearts. And in a small house in Coyoacan, an aunt and nephew built a family from the ashes of so much pain, demonstrating that sometimes the family you choose is worth more than any blood tie, and that the most powerful love is the one that survives when everything else has burned.